Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus A330 pilot, and welcome to today's video landing the A340 in Storm Benjamin in Cologne. So this is going to be an interesting one. It's not necessarily intended as a tutorial, but nonetheless I will talk about pretty much everything that we need to take into consideration on an approach like this. But let's go ahead and actually get started with a couple of the basics, and that's the actual weather that we have. So we're going to approach runway 13 left in Cologne, and the wind is currently 210 at 19, gust 30, and we've got a temporary 210 at 25, gust 40. Now that down here is above the crosswind limit on our runway, so if we got those weather conditions and tower is going to report what we are going to have on the approach in the real world, then we couldn't actually land, but this one is just about landable, so that's going to make it pretty interesting. We are operating right on the edge of the envelope of our aircraft today. Now, the approach itself is going to be the ILS approach to runway 13 left. As you can see, a fairly easy one going around the corner over here on the approach, and then a nice approach out of 3,000 feet for a typical 10-mile final. We have already fed everything into our FMS with the weather data. Note that we do enter just the standard wind, we do not enter the gusts down here. The reason we do this is because of the way how the approach is calculated in the Airbus. Now, what Airbus is going to do is they calculate the headwind component, and when that exceeds a certain value, the approach is automatically going to be increased. For this reason, we enter the steady winds in order to get the calculated V approach, and when the actual winds, aka the gusts, are higher than this, then our approach speed target on the primary flight display is simply going to increase or decrease as necessary. It's not going to decrease below the approach though. This is actually called the ground speed mini function, which is designed so that the ground speed changes when the gusts happen are minimized in order to provide us with a constant and smooth approach. Now, let's talk a little bit about the techniques that we are going to have to use today. Now, starting with the approach itself, slowing the airplane down is going to be not that much of a challenge with this as a headwind, but if this was an actual tailwind, then I would absolutely start slowing the airplane down early, and early can mean easily like 10 miles from the final approach fix, just to be sure that we got full control over the aircraft's energy throughout the approach. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about the wind shear escape, because wind shear approaching in a storm like we do right now is always a possible factor. Now, wind shear escape maneuver is quite easy. If a predictive wind shear alert happens, we can outmaneuver the wind shear and therefore not apply the maneuver, but if a reactive wind shear alert happens, we always have to apply the wind shear escape maneuver. That's actually quite easy. Thrust levers full forward. Then on the A340, initial pitch 12.5, thereafter follow the flight director. On the A330 it would be 15 and follow the flight director. Now, maintain the configuration, that means flaps and landing gear, and only when out of the wind shear we are going to recover into normal flight, which is going to be done by most importantly checking that the flaps are in an appropriate position and that we're not over speeding the flaps. Now let's quickly talk about the autopilot. So the autopilot is going to try as good as it possibly can to maintain control of the aircraft. However, if it gets too turbulent, then the autopilot may trip off and we may have to continue flying the approach manually. That is something that absolutely does happen in the real world, and it's something that we simply got to take into consideration. However, a manual approach may be continued. If that happens, then we're somewhat in a disadvantage in flight simulation versus the real world. In the real world, you got the pilot monitoring, who is going to take a careful look at what you are doing as pilot flying and is going to correct you wherever needed. In flight simulation, we're kinda on our own over here, so that is absolutely something to take into consideration. Now, Airbus wide-body aircraft do not have an autothrust system that works very well under conditions like these. Why is that so important? Because you may absolutely have to use manual thrust in order to keep your speed under control. That happens on the real world, and it happens in Flight Simulator as well. So be prepared to disconnect autothrust and use manual thrust as required, especially when you're above a target speed and autothrust is still adding thrust even though you should be slowing down. Now, let's quickly talk about the stabilized approach criteria. We can absolutely expect to be an IMC over here, so we are always going to use the 1000 foot gate in weather conditions like these. Now, I'm going to simplify this a little bit because we've talked about the stabilized approach criteria quite often on this channel already. So basically, you got to be on pitch, on speed, on glide path, on localizer, and in an appropriate landing configuration with thrust set. And when all of those criteria are met, we can continue through the 1000 foot gate. Otherwise, go around becomes mandatory, can come back for a second approach if the weather is so that it is expected that you could successfully complete a second approach. Alright, so with all of that in mind, we are turning towards the final, and you can see I'm starting to prepare the airplane rather early. Looking at the wind vector over here, it is going to turn a little bit as we're getting closer to the ground, but looking at the wind vector over here, there is a good chance that we may face a little bit of tailwind on the final descent. For this reason, I'm slowing the airplane early, and funnily enough, you can already see ground speed mini in action down there, targeting more than the air speed because of that wind factor. But look at, as we're turning out of the wind, that wind turns into more and more a tailwind. The target speed actually goes down, so that's pretty much what we're expecting to happen over here. Now we're in nice land and intercept heading, approach mode is on, CAT 3 dual, autopilot 1 and 2, glide slope localizer are blue. I'm going to keep it on config 1 for the time being, but look at that wind component over here, absolutely turning into a tailwind, so got to keep careful control here of what our airplane is doing and start reducing speed early. Especially those wide-body aircraft are very, very slippery, so early control of the speed is absolutely mandatory. You can nicely see how the ground speed is 210 now, while true airspeed is just 180. For this reason, when the glide is coming alive, I am already going to go flaps 2, which is just now, so that we are not going to be too fast on our way down and still have a chance of slowing the aircraft down. So what's the wind right now? Still 210 at 19, gust 30, so it is going to turn left as we get lower, and we do have to anticipate that happening. Glide slope localizer captured, go around altitude 3000 is set, and well, with that wind we can absolutely go into landing configuration already. So landing gear down, flaps 3, speed check, flaps 3, and now let's start slowing us down. Alright, and flaps full. Now you may be wondering, why am I using flaps full rather than flaps 3? Now, you would be absolutely right that on some aircraft, like for example the 737, a lower flap setting is better. However, the wide-body Airbuses are so slippery that it is so hard to lose speed in config 3 that I would absolutely use config full, not just to bring the pitch down a little bit on approach, but also to help us with a little bit of additional drag in order to keep the airplane under a better control. Now look at this, speed is barely coming down because of the tailwind, however the wind should be turning to the left pretty soon, so we are prepared for that to happen, and we will probably witness the ground speed mini target increasing when that is about to happen. Now, runway is already inside up there, that's good. However, let's go ahead and turn those wipers on. Now let's talk about the flare and the touchdown. Normal flare height for a wide-body Airbus is about 40 feet. Now, just increase the pitch slightly, thrust to idle as needed, and I really need to emphasize the as needed over here. if a gust hits you in the wrong moment and you're losing some speed, then... Oh yeah, talk about gusts. So if a gust hits us in the wrong moment and we're losing speed, then we absolutely need to keep a little bit of thrust so that the airplane does not just plunge down into the ground. Well, apart from that, decrap the airplane in the flare. You can land it in a crap angle on a wet runway. On a dry runway, try to avoid that as it's not very good for the tires. So decrap during the flare. Up to 5 degrees of crap angle on final approach is allowed. And most importantly, to control the aircraft, we are using the rudder to align it with the runway center line, but we're using the ailerons in order to keep us on that center line and not drift away. Alright, and with all of that now talked about, we've got realistic turbulence turned on here in order to make things fun. Let's disconnect the automatics and make this a nice landing. So for the time being, auto thrust is doing a good job here, but look at that. That's how the turbulence can happen. Continue. So on short final, it's favorable to control pitch and descent rate rather than maintaining the glide slope below about 200. So, decrap, flare, idle, and a little bit into the wind. Here we go. That is looking fantastic. Alright, we're down. Don't hold it off the ground because it can blow you off the runway very easily. Reversers are out, spoilers are out, and we have decel. Well, and that's about everything that goes into this. Looks easy? Well, use historical weather, find yourself a proper storm with some lovely crosswind, and then give it a go. For now, that's going to be everything for this video, so thank you very much for watching. As always, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much, and we're looking forward to see you all again on the next one.